Hello, I'm Charlie. I was born in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and I lived there until I went to college. When I was younger, I had frequented the Bay Beach amusement park, but as I was growing up, I realized that nobody could really swim in the water there and that you couldn't really fish either. I had seen some people doing this as I got older, but generally it wasn't really safe to do so, and I didn't really know why until I got older and I did more research on the history of the bay. So this is going to be focusing more on my research of the area rather than my previous knowledge, using some articles that were published from 2017 to 2024, kind of document the history and the different movements that have been going on with the area. I'm going to be referencing Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, because it struck to me as a pretty relevant piece of media, especially because of the nature of this specific environmental problem, and I'll go more into that later. From Governing the Commons, I learned of 8 design principles that are required to effectively manage common pool resources, like the water and the land that's on the shoreline of the bay. A lot of the water that flows into the bay is actually from the Fox River, and this comes from Lake Winnebago, and I have some maps on the screen here to give you a visual reference point of what that looks like. While the Fox River flows all the way from Green Bay to even past Lake Winnebago, since there's 2 parts of the river, I will be discussing specifically the Bay Beach area, which is on the east of the river's watershed and is on the shoreline of the area of concern that is in black in this photo on the shoreline of Green Bay. As kind of like a general timeline of what I'll be going through, I'm going to be going through the history of the area and kind of discussing what kind of movements have been going on. And then I'll move into the design principles and whether they're present and the kind of the development of those things. And then I'll go into the conclusion. So for the history, it kind of started in the 1890s. In this time, it was a very popular recreational destination, and there was even a trolley line to transport people to the beach. It was a very popular swimming spot, and there was plenty of boaters, and there was even people picnicking in this area as well. In the 1920s, sewage was flowing into the Fox River, and it all emptied into the bay here. It killed a lot of fish, and it smelled very bad according to locals, and human waste was contaminating the water. And there's also a bunch of industrial waste as well, which was intensified from industries like sawmills and paper mills, which were going through a boom here during this time. From these industries, there was sulfur and phosphorus and other chemicals that were pumped into the water. And along with all the farming that was going on, there was tons of nitrogen being extended into the bay because of runoff from farmlands, specifically from fertilizers. People kind of recognized this was going on, and some solutions were proposed, but they were definitely not taken seriously or executed on because of skepticism and how much money was required to actually start solving these issues. Beaches were closed and they were opened, and this was just kind of a cycle that depended on how much rainfall was going on and how much industries were discharging during different seasons. Swimmers reported skin rashes after being exposed to the water, which was named the itch. From the 1930s to the 1940s, residents and health departments started finding that the conditions were honestly unsafe and just unbearable. Instead of solving the issues, the city kind of developed swimming pools that were meant to satisfy the demand of going swimming, but the bay was generally left ignored. At this time, officials recognized that the cleanup effort would take multiple generations to even get the beach back to bearable health due to how large scale the pollution was in the bay. In the 1940s, journalists took photographs of the mud and sewage in the bay as community members began to understand how polluted the bay actually was. And in 1943, the beach was permanently closed for swimming due to the contamination. And then here's a photo that shows how much the flow was going into the bay. In the 1960s, residents began to miss the golden era. Most officials were uncertain if the pollution programs would actually succeed, and Bay Beach was seen as a lost part of Green Bay's history. And in general, the public's perception of the area was just very generally pessimistic. In the late 20th century to the 2000s, dredging efforts began in the Fox River to try to remove PCBs. And in in the 2010s, Mayor Jim Schmidt began to revive the idea of restoring this beach, but unfortunately it required significant funding of about $5 million to even get this project started. It took the city council about 6 years to get this funding and to proceed with the initiative, and instead of being nostalgic about the golden era being gone, the public generally began to get the beach revitalized. In 2018, the plan was initially to build a pier, a boardwalk, a bathhouse, new parking lots, and a sand beach. But in 2020, the plan got split into 2 phases. The first phase being a wildlife viewing platform, and the second being the sand beach. And by 2024, phase 1 was funded and was expected to start in the fall of 2025, which is when I'm recording this right now. And in 2026, the plan is to consider funding phase 2, which would include actually creating the sand beach. However, there are still a lot of major concerns because it's likely many years away. And this is because there's a lot of pretty substantial erosion. There's a big dead spot in the bay. There's high levels of E. coli, algae blooms, and fish kills due to the contaminated water. This really depends on the season, but wildlife is starting to return and the water is starting to clear up, although there are different spikes depending on the season. So that's kind of a general overview of the history of the area, but let's talk about the design principles. The first design principle is to have clearly defined boundaries. And in the beginning of the history that I talked about, there were no boundaries on who could use the water or who could dump waste into the bay. There were also no limits on who could appropriate, or like the number of appropriators, or how much of the resource you could actually use. But in the present day, there are now more boundaries from the EPA and the DNR. Second design principle is congruence between rules and local needs. In the beginning, rules did not match ecological conditions at all. The rather shallow bay collected pollutants near the shore, but waste was still pumped out and it continued to pile up. With the new cleanup efforts, PCBs are being dredged and phosphorus is being reduced to help manage the pollutants in the bay. And the local wants now are to open up the bay back for recreation, but first they must restore the environment before this can actually happen. The third design principle is collective choice arrangements, and in the past, locals had no real say on how the industries used the bay. The industry and the government kind of just controlled the resource usage, but now the city is actually involving community members, and residents have more of a say on what they want the projects to look like and if they want the beach to be reopened. The system is definitely not great, but it is significantly better. And in terms of monitoring, which is the fourth design principle, before the current movement, there was no real monitoring of the water. And the only thing that really inspired the beach to close was the itch or the rashes that swimmers reported. And now the EPA and the DNR actively monitor for PCBs, bacteria, and algae. However, monitoring is a major requirement for the cleanup process, and so there's a lot of monitoring going on in the present day. Wildlife is also returning, which is a good sign that the biological conditions of the water are improving, and that is also being monitored. Number 5 on the design's principles are graduated sanctions. Before the revitalization movement, there was no real consequences for any industry dumping waste into the water. They just kind of got away with it and didn't really receive many consequences, but now there are tons of legal and financial penalties for violating the new rules, and there's also fines for future violations. I'm not entirely sure how graduated they are, but there's at least some sort of sanctions going on now. The sixth design principle is conflict resolution mechanisms, and the conflict resolution is mostly in the hands of the federal and state government in this situation. However, there are also public meetings from the city of Green Bay where residents can actually voice their thoughts on reopening the beach, and they have some sort of outlet to communicate any desires or grievances. Design principle is minimal recognition of rights to organize. The city organizes public meetings to gather input, and local groups also advocate for environmental protections. However, the majority of the control lies with the EPA and the DNR. the community is not really given the authority to manage the bay independently, so they rely on other organizations. The eighth principle is nested enterprises. The enterprises in the cleanup as of today are pretty well nested. On a local level, there's the Parks Department and also the City of Green Bay, as well as community input. On a regional level, there's Wisconsin DNR, and on a federal level, there is the US EPA and the Superfund program. And on top of this, there are also scientific partners like different universities and environmental consultants that are working on the restoration project. So that's all the design principles that I wanted to talk about. And from this discussion of how these design principles have developed over Green Bay's history, we can see that a lot of Ostrom's design principles were missing in the beginning and kind of caused for this pollution to become a major issue. We also see that a lot of the design principles were developed later on in response to the intense pollution of the water in the area. And we can also see that the improvement of the water, as more of these principles were embodied by the environmental protection movement, occurred as it progressed. One of the major problems occurring today is securing funding for the revitalization of the bay and the shoreline, along with the Fox River. It seems like the restoration date will be further along in the future than the public would like to hear, which is leading to frustration and impatience and less funding. Maybe one day in the future, we will get to see the beach return to its golden era, now with proper organization and control of the environment, with more implementation of the design principles we discussed. But that will probably be several years in the future, at minimum. Thank you for watching this place narrative about the Bay Beach in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and have a great day.